The most profound challenges we face in our lives rarely start with us. They are passed down like a heavy, invisible heirloom. Patterns of behavior travel through generations until someone finally has the courage to look at the weight they are carrying and decide, this stops with me. When we talk about a generational cycle of manipulation, we are talking about a systemic structure. Manipulation in families is rarely born out of pure malice. It is born out of survival. A parent who uses guilt, conditional love, or emotional withdrawal to control a child is often simply practicing the only language they were ever taught. They learned that to be safe, they must control. To be loved, they must manipulate. And so, without intervention, the hurt child grows up to become the hurting parent. The cycle continues not because people are inherently bad, but because human beings default to what is familiar. Breaking this cycle requires a fundamental shift in our understanding of safety and connection. If you grew up in an environment where love had strings attached, your inner child, the core of your emotional processing, learned that being authentic is dangerous. You learned to hyper-vigilate, to read the room, to become who others needed you to be just to stay safe. Healing that inner child is not an act of soft sentimentality. It is a rigorous process of leadership. It means becoming the dependable, stable leader that your younger self never had. To heal, we must change the metrics of our relationships. We must move from a culture of compliance to a culture of trust. This starts with boundary setting. Boundaries are not walls to keep people out. They are clear indicators of where you end and someone else begins. When you set a boundary with a manipulative family member, you are rewriting the rules of engagement. You are stating that love and control cannot coexist in the same space. This process is incredibly uncomfortable because it disrupts the established ecosystem. The system will fight to maintain its old balance, but true leadership, especially leadership over one's own life, is about enduring short-term discomfort for long-term health by doing the difficult work of addressing your trauma, validating your past experiences, and refusing to pass the old scripts down to the next generation. You change the trajectory of your entire family line. You become the foundation upon which a healthier, more authentic future is built. Fef keynotes of the speech, The Origin of Manipulation. Generational manipulation is a learned survival mechanism passed down through families, driven by a deep-seated need for control rather than intentional malice. The vulnerability of the inner child. Children exposed to emotional manipulation learn to prioritize compliance over authenticity, creating deeply ingrained habits of people-pleasing and hypervigilance in adulthood. Healing is self-leadership. Healing the inner child requires taking emotional responsibility for your own life and becoming the protective, consistent presence you lacked during your upbringing. The function of boundaries. Establishing clear boundaries is essential for breaking the cycle, acting not as a tool for punishment, but as a framework to separate love from control. The cost of systemic change. Disrupting long-standing family dynamics causes temporary friction and discomfort, but it is a necessary investment to prevent passing generational trauma to future generations. Generational manipulation within a family system rarely begins with an act of conscious malice. Instead, it operates like an invisible, inherited script passed down from one generation to the next under the guise of protection, love, or tradition. To truly understand why this happens, we have to look at the structural foundation of how human beings learn to survive. Every child enters the world entirely dependent on their primary caregivers for physical safety and emotional validation. The family unit is the very first ecosystem a human being experiences, and the rules of that ecosystem dictate how the child learns to navigate the rest of the world. When that ecosystem is governed by manipulation, whether through emotional blackmail, guilt, conditional affection, or gaslighting, it is almost always because the parents themselves are operating out of a deep-seated, unresolved fear. They are using the exact same survival mechanisms that were modeled for them during their own formative years. When a parent uses manipulation to control a child's behavior, choices, or emotions, they are rarely doing so with the explicit intent to cause psychological harm. In their mind, control equates to safety. If they can control the environment, control how their children think, and control how the family is perceived by the outside world, they can keep their own deep anxieties at bay. This intense need for control is typically born out of their own unhealed childhood trauma. Perhaps they grew up in a household where resources were scarce, where affection was a luxury, or where vulnerability was met with punishment. To survive that environment, they learn to suppress their authentic feelings and instead use strategic behaviors to secure safety and attention. They learned that to get their needs met, they could not simply ask directly, they had to manipulate the situation. Because human beings naturally default to what is familiar, these survival strategies eventually harden into permanent personality traits and parenting styles. When these individuals have children of their own, they unconsciously project their unresolved fears onto the next generation. They do not see their children as independent individuals with distinct emotional needs. Rather, they view them as extensions of themselves or as instruments to validate their own self-worth. If a child expresses independence or challenges the family narrative, the parent feels a profound sense of threat. To neutralize this threat and restore order, the parent deploys the only tools they know: guilt trips, silent treatments, or playing the victim. This is how the cycle becomes institutionalized within a family lineage. The manipulation is normalized to the point where it is woven into the very fabric of daily communication. Phrases like, "after everything I have done for you," or "if you love me, you wouldn't do this," are used to enforce compliance. The child, desperate for love and belonging, learns to override their own intuition and comply with the manipulation. In doing so, the child internalizes the exact same toxic lesson their parents did, that love is conditional, that vulnerability is dangerous, and that control is the only way to maintain a relationship. Without a conscious intervention, that child will grow up, enter relationships, and eventually raise their own children using those exact same strategies. They will manipulate not because they want to inflict pain, but because they genuinely do not know how to connect with another human being through authentic vulnerability. They are simply passing down the heavy inheritance they were given. Breaking this cycle requires us to look at our caregivers not through the lens of anger, but through the lens of systemic understanding. It demands that we recognize that their manipulative behavior was a symptom of their own unhealed brokenness. Acknowledging this origin does not excuse the harm they caused, but it strips the manipulation of its power. It allows us to see that the behavior was never a reflection of our worth as individuals, but rather a reflection of a historical, generational survival mechanism that simply ran out of time. To fully grasp the psychological toll of a manipulative upbringing, we must look closely at how a child's mind adapts to an environment where affection is conditional and emotional safety is scarce. Children possess an innate biological need for attachment and validation from their primary caregivers. This need is tied directly to their sense of survival. When a child grows up in a household where love is used as a tool for control, where guilt is weaponized, or where emotional warmth can be abruptly withdrawn, the child faces an existential crisis. They quickly realize that showing up as their true authentic self, with their own unique boundaries, loud emotions, or independent desires, frequently leads to conflict, rejection, or abandonment. To survive in this system, the developing mind makes a tragic but necessary compromise. It learns to prioritize compliance over authenticity. This shift from authenticity to compliance completely rewires the child's emotional baseline, giving rise to deeply ingrained habits of people-pleasing and hyper-vigilance that persist long into adulthood. In a manipulative family system, the child becomes an acute observer of human behavior out of sheer necessity. They become experts at reading the room, decoding subtle shifts in a parent's facial expressions, the heavy sound of a footstep, or the suffocating tension of a silent treatment. This is the birth of hypervigilance, a chronic state of nervous system arousal where the individual is constantly scanning their environment for hidden threats, emotional traps, or incoming disapproval. The child learns to suppress their own voice and instead asks themselves a singular, exhausting question. Who do I need to be in this exact moment to keep the peace and stay safe? As this survival strategy solidifies, the child masters the art of emotional shifting. If a parent needs them to be high, achieving to satisfy an ego, they become a perfectionist. If a parent needs them to be small and silent to avoid triggering an outburst, they become invisible. If a parent projects their own emotional instability onto the household, the child takes on the role of the caretaker, managing the adult's emotions while completely abandoning their own. This chronic self-abandonment erodes the child's developing sense of identity. Because their own feelings were routinely dismissed, manipulated, or punished, they lose touch with their internal compass. They grow up unable to answer basic questions about what they actually want, what they truly believe, or where their own boundaries lie, because their entire life has been an exercise in adapting to the emotional gravity of others. When these children step into adulthood, the heavy armor of compliance and hyper-vigilance does not simply disappear. It transforms into a profound psychological blueprint for all subsequent relationships. The adult who was once a manipulated child walks into workplaces, friendships, and romantic partnerships with the same underlying assumption that love and safety must be earned through perpetual sacrifice and performance. In the workplace, this manifests as an inability to say no, leading to severe burnout and resentment, as they subconsciously treat their managers and colleagues like the volatile figures from their past. In romantic relationships, it often leads them directly back into the arms of manipulative or emotionally unavailable partners, because the familiar dance of trying to win over someone who holds all the cards feels like the only version of love they know. The tragedy of this deeply ingrained habit is that the individual becomes a prisoner to the perceptions of others. They live in a constant state of anxiety, terrified that if they ever reveal their true thoughts, set a firm boundary, or display a flaw, the entire structure of their life will come crashing down. Their self-worth becomes entirely externalized, dependent on a never-ending cycle of validation and approval that can never quite fill the void left by their childhood self-abandonment. The habit of reading people and anticipating their needs, which was once a brilliant and necessary survival mechanism for a helpless child, becomes a paralyzing cage for the adult, preventing true intimacy, authentic self-expression, and genuine emotional freedom. The conceptual transition from being a passive victim of a manipulative family system to becoming an active agent of one's own healing requires a radical embrace of self-leadership. When we look at the process of healing the inner child, it is easy to relegate the concept to the realm of passive introspection or purely emotional processing. However, true healing is an act of profound and rigorous personal leadership. It demands that an individual step into the vacuum left by their original caregivers and consciously choose to become the protective, consistent, and dependable presence they completely lacked during their developmental years. This is not about changing the past, nor is it about forcing accountability on people who may never be capable of giving it. It is about taking full emotional responsibility for the quality of one's own life in the present moment. To understand self-leadership in the context of healing, we must examine what an injured inner child actually is. It is not a literal entity, but rather a collection of unmet developmental needs, frozen emotional responses, and survival habits embedded within our psychology and nervous system. When a child grows up experiencing manipulation, their primary emotional reality is one of instability. They learn that the adults who are supposed to protect them are unpredictable, emotionally volatile, or transactional. As a result, the child's emotional growth stalls in areas of trust, self-worth, and safety. When that child becomes an adult, those unhealed pockets of trauma remain highly reactive. A minor criticism at work or a slight pull back from a romantic partner can instantly trigger the adult's nervous system, sending them straight back into the panic, defensiveness, or compliance of their childhood self. Self-leadership is the conscious intervention in these moments of emotional aggression. It is the ability of the adult self to observe the rising panic of the inner child and say, "I see you. I understand why you are terrified, but I am in charge now and I will keep us safe." When you practice self-leadership, you stop looking outward for the validation and protection you missed as a child. You stop waiting for a manipulative parent to finally apologize or for a partner to perfectly anticipate your triggers. Instead, you build an internal infrastructure of safety. You become the one who validates your own reality when others try to gaslight you. You become the one who protects your peace, regulates your nervous system, and honors your own emotional truth. This process requires a complete overhaul of how we talk to and treat ourselves. In a manipulative environment, children absorb a harsh, critical, and demanding internal voice. They learn to berate themselves for making mistakes, to feel intense guilt for having basic human needs, and to view their own vulnerability as a dangerous weakness. Stepping into a position of leadership over your internal world means firing that internalized critic and replacing it with a voice of fierce, unwavering compassion and consistency. Consistency is the foundation of trust. And because your inner child never experienced emotional consistency from caregivers, you must demonstrate it to yourself daily. This means showing up for yourself when you are exhausted, keeping the promises you make to yourself, and refusing to abandon your own values just to keep the peace in a toxic room. Ultimately, viewing healing through the lens of leadership changes the entire dynamic of recovery from a position of weakness to a position of immense power. It acknowledges that while you were entirely blameless for the environment that wounded you as a child, you are entirely responsible for the adult you choose to become. It is a grueling daily discipline of monitoring your reactions, choosing consciousness over habit, and intentionally repairing the parts of yourself that were left fractured. By taking up this mantle of self-leadership, you effectively strip the past of its power to dictate your future. You stop waiting for a rescue squad that is never coming and realize that the leader you have been searching for your entire life is the person looking back at you in the mirror. The introduction of clear, unyielding boundaries within a dysfunctional family structure represents the structural pivot point where the cycle of manipulation is actively dismantled. For an individual who has spent a lifetime navigating an environment where emotional blackmail, guilt, and control were disguised as affection, the concept of a boundary is often deeply misunderstood. It is frequently misconstrued as an act of aggression, a declaration of war, or a wall designed to punish and isolate others. However, when viewed through the lens of healthy human architecture, a boundary is fundamentally a framework of clarity. It is the defining line that separates one individual's emotional property from another's. To break a generational cycle, one must realize that a boundary is not an attempt to change control or punish a manipulative person. It is a clear, explicit statement of what you will and will not tolerate in order to protect your own psychological integrity. In a manipulative family ecosystem, boundaries are viewed as an existential threat because the entire system relies on their absence. A manipulative dynamic operates on fusion, a state where a parent or caregiver believes their child's emotions, choices, and life trajectory are merely extensions of their own. In this fused state, love and control become completely intertwined. The parent believes that controlling the child is an expression of love, and the child is taught that complying with the parent's control is proof of loyalty. When you break this cycle by setting a boundary, you are intentionally disrupting this illusion. You are stating unequivocally that love and control cannot coexist in the exact same space. You are establishing that you can love someone deeply while simultaneously refusing to allow them to dictate your emotional state, weaponize your vulnerabilities, or violate your peace. Implementing this framework requires a massive shift in how language and actions are used. In the past, compliance was the currency used to buy safety. When a boundary is set, the currency changes to self-respect. A boundary must be communicated not with anger or a desire to litigate the past, but with a calm, neutral, and absolute clarity. It sounds like stating, I will not participate in conversations where I am being yelled at or guilted. And if this continues, I will end the phone call or leave the room. The power of a boundary lies entirely in its enforcement. A boundary without a consequence is merely an invitation for further manipulation. When the manipulative individual inevitably tests the boundary, because the system always fights to maintain its old balance, the boundary setter must follow through with the stated action, completely detached from the guilt trips or explosive reactions that follow. This practice is incredibly difficult because a manipulative system will immediately weaponize the boundary, attempting to reframe it as selfishness, cruelty, or a lack of filial piety. The individual setting the boundary will be flooded with a profound ancestral sense of guilt because their inner child still associates boundary setting with abandonment and danger. Overcoming this guilt is the core work of breaking the cycle. You must accept that people who profit from your lack of boundaries will always interpret your boundaries as an attack. Their negative reaction is not proof that you have done something wrong. It is simply proof that the boundary is working and that the old mechanisms of control are losing their grip. Ultimately, boundaries are an act of profound respect, not just for oneself, but ironically for the relationship itself. By drawing a clear line where you end and the other person begins, you are offering them the only opportunity they have to interact with the real, authentic you, rather than a resentful, compliant version of you. You are refusing to participate in the silent, toxic contracts that have poisoned the family line for generations. By firmly separating love from control, you create a safe zone where true healing can take place, ensuring that your own nervous system is no longer a battleground for other people's unmanaged trauma. The decision to actively disrupt a generational cycle of manipulation is ultimately a choice to invite a profound, systemic crisis into your life. When an individual resolves that they will no longer carry the inherited trauma of their family line, they are not merely making a private, internal adjustment. They are launching a quiet revolution against an established ecosystem. Family systems, much like biological organisms, possess a fierce, instinctive drive toward homeostasis. They seek to preserve their existing balance, their familiar hierarchies, and their historic patterns of behavior at all costs, regardless of how toxic or destructive those patterns might be. Therefore, when you choose to heal, set firm boundaries, and refuse to participate in the old scripts of guilt and control, the system will not applaud your growth. It will fight back. True leadership over your own life requires the immense psychological stamina to endure this short-term chaos and systemic friction in order to secure long-term, multi-generational health. When you step out of your assigned role within a dysfunctional family structure, the immediate reaction of the system is a frantic attempt to pull you back into alignment. This is often referred to as systemic pushback. The people who have long benefited from your compliance, your silence, or your willingness to absorb their emotional projections will experience your healing as an act of betrayal. Because they lack the self-awareness or the emotional tools to meet you at a level of healthy vulnerability, their default response will be to intensify the very manipulation you are trying to escape. They may engage in smear campaigns, enlist other family members to act as emotional emitters to pressure you, or utilize intense bouts of gaslighting to make you question your own sanity and motives. The friction this creates is incredibly painful because it forces you to face the agonizing reality that your growth is directly causing discomfort to the people you love. Enduring this systemic friction demands that you completely reframe the meaning of conflict. In a manipulative environment, you were taught that conflict is a dangerous sign of failure and that maintaining a surface level, artificial peace is the highest virtue. To break the cycle, you must realize that the discomfort and tension you are experiencing are not signs that you are doing something wrong. They are proof that you are doing something right. The friction is a natural byproduct of a broken machine resisting a fundamental repair. If you fold under the weight of this temporary discomfort just to ease the immediate tension in the family, you are simply purchasing short-term relief at the exorbitant cost of your long-term freedom and the emotional health of any future generations who will inherit your unresolved compliance. This process requires a willingness to sit with a deep, existential loneliness. When you choose to become the emotional circuit breaker of your family line, you are often walking an entirely uncharted path alone. You are forced to mourn not only the childhood you never had, but also the relationships in the present that cannot survive your boundaries. It is a process of voluntary exile from the familiar, comfortable warmth of shared dysfunction. However, it is precisely within this crucible of discomfort that true, unshakable strength is forged. By standing firm in your reality, refusing to react to the provocations, and consistently choosing consciousness over inherited habit, you are doing the grueling, invisible work of altering human history. The ultimate ROI of this immense emotional investment is rarely witnessed overnight. It is a long-term play. By absorbing the shockwaves of the system's resistance without passing them forward, you effectively clean the slate. You ensure that the toxic habits, the emotional blackmail, the unspoken rules of compliance, and the suffocating hyper-vigilance that poisoned your own upbringing stop entirely with you. The discomfort you endure today becomes the very armor of peace, authenticity, and emotional safety that will shield the next generation. You are trading the temporary, volatile comfort of a dysfunctional family dynamic for the permanent foundation of a healthy, self-directed future, establishing a brand new lineage built on a culture of trust rather than control. Breaking a generational cycle is not a single, grand act of defiance. It is a quiet daily choice to choose consciousness over habit. It is the realization that while you were completely blameless for the environment that wounded you as a child, you are entirely responsible for the adult you choose to become. It requires you to look at the patterns of manipulation, guilt, and control that travel through decades to reach you, and possess the immense courage to say, This stops with me. When you step into the role of the emotional circuit breaker for your family line, you are doing the hardest work a human being can do. You are choosing the short-term friction of standing in your truth over the long-term decay of living in compliance. You are choosing to reparent your inner child, to build walls of protection through boundaries, and to transform your survival mechanisms into self-leadership. It is a lonely path, and it is a painful path. The system will resist, and the guilt will whisper that you are wrong. But remember this, you are not destroying a family. You are saving a lineage. By enduring the discomfort of healing today, you are clearing the emotional ground for tomorrow. You are ensuring that the children who come after you will never have to heal from their childhoods just to survive their adulthoods. You become the foundation upon which a healthier, safer, and completely authentic future is built.